Week 9 is officially upon us, and today I'm bringing you guys forth my top 30 wide receivers in the tier list format I do on every single Friday, where I break down my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my 5 favorite deep flex plays. If you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your biggest start sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible, and of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We're on the road to 40,000. Appreciate you guys for that continued support. But with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, before I head into the official top 30, I go through the will they play tier, and the general rule of thumb of this tier, if you guys are new to the channel, is that we'd like to see at least one full practice prior to Sunday's game, and if not, I would lean towards a slightly lower ranked counterpart. So the will they play tier for this week is occupied by Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, and Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Starting off with Puka Nacua, he was limited at practice with a knee injury that he suffered against the Dallas Cowboys. It doesn't really sound concerning. It sounds like there's some swelling at this point, but he is expected to play for this game. So if Puka Nacua is able to suit up, fire him in your lineup with top 15 level confidence. Obviously, there's some news there with Matthew Stafford. We don't exactly know the nature of his thumb injury. If he suits up, if he plays, again, top 15 level expectation, but there is this downside there that Matthew Stafford doesn't play. You guys will know that by Sunday when you set your lineups. Drake London, wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons, dealing with a groin injury that flared up this past week's game, and his status at this current point is up in the air. It's unclear whether he's going to play through injury, whether he's going to sit this week out. If he does play, I would lower my expectations for him to more so a fringe top 36 level play, knowing that that injury could flare at any given point. I would rather look elsewhere if you have Drake London. Tyler Lockett, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks. He was limited in practice with the hamstring injury that he played through this past week. Wouldn't be shocked, he's an older wide receiver. They're probably taking precaution. Hamstring injuries, they're very fickle. You don't want to deal with that when it comes to, like I said, older wide receivers. I'm not surprised that the Seahawks are handling this injury the way they have been. However, like I said, he played through this injury last week, had a very big time performance against the Browns. I do expect him to play, and he would be well within the wide receiver 3 mix if he does play in this game. Now we head on to the bye week teams, occupied by 4 teams this week, with the San Francisco 49ers, the Denver Broncos, the Detroit Lions, and the Jacksonville Jaguars all on bye. Therefore, if you have guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Christian Kirk, and Calvin Ridley, be prepared to be without them on your teams this week. But now we on to the official list, and we start off with my wide receivers 1 to 6. The 3 guys I will be talking about are going to be Tyreek Hill, AJ Brown, and CeeDee Lamb. Starting off with Tyreek Hill, obviously the Miami Dolphins this week, 9:30 a.m. kickoff game in Germany against the Kansas City Chiefs. Tyreek Hill is my wide receiver 1 overall, and aside from the obvious revenge game narrative, he was a big-time Kansas City Chiefs player, was the wide receiver 1 for them when they won the Super Bowl back in 2019. Obviously, that is at stake to a certain degree. He's going to have some intrinsic motivation in that own right. However, Tyreek Hill is still a player averaging 26.5 PPR points per game. He is the clear-cut fantasy football wide receiver 1. He's commanding over 10 targets per game. He's a player that can break a game open on any single target, and this game has the highest implied total of the entire slate. Miami's implied for nearly 25 points, and I think he's arguably the number 1 overall player in fantasy. You can make the argument between Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey. I don't think you're wrong either way, but I do think that what Tyreek Hill has been able to do this year has been legendary. Again, 26.5 PPR points per game. He's legitimately had a Cooper Kupp-esque level season. AJ Brown and CeeDee Lamb, wide receivers of the Philadelphia Eagles and Dallas Cowboys, respectively. Obviously, clashing heads this Sunday, 4:25 kickoff. You guys know I will be ready for that game. AJ Brown coming in as my wide receiver 4, CeeDee Lamb coming in as my wide receiver 5 on the week, respectively. And this is, of course, the game I'm going to be paying the most attention to. They are the alphas on their respective teams. Brown and Lamb are 2 of the very best wide receivers in the entire NFL. And let's start off on the AJ Brown side, because I do have to give him his flowers, man. He's been absolutely dominant this year. 125 plus receiving yards in his last 6 games, and he has been one of the biggest reasons why the Eagles are 7-1 and leading the NFL in terms of record right now. While the Cowboys have been good against opposing wide receivers, they do run a ton of man coverage, something that AJ Brown has absolutely obliterated across the season. This is the game you needed Trayvon Diggs for. Obviously, Trayvon Diggs for the Cowboys, out for the year, tore his ACL a few weeks ago. A.J. Brown's going to be a problem. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. I expect the Eagles to be able to revolve around A.J. Brown, and if they're going to try to single this guy all game, I think we're in for a long game. I expect the over to hit in this matchup, but that's not to take away from CeeDee Lamb, because on the other side, it's felt like a mixed bag at times. I'm not going to lie. If you've had CeeDee Lamb a couple weeks ago, you're probably wondering, if is this guy a wide receiver 2 in fantasy? Is he a low-end wide receiver 1? Like, what are we dealing with here? These last couple games for CeeDee Lamb has really established the confidence in him moving forward. He's a top 6 overall wide receiver for me rest of the season, and he's up to the wide receiver 10 in PPR points per game. The offense obviously struggled against San Francisco, but since that game against the Chargers and against the Rams, we saw this Cowboys passing attack, and specifically Dak Prescott, really show up in the big moments. So the Eagles are an easy matchup on the matchup chart. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers this year. And the way to beat this Eagles defense is by airing it out on the outside. Their main strength is that defensive line, is that pass rush. They're a little bit more susceptible in the back end. Their secondary hasn't been playing the same this year, with James Bradbury struggling at times. And I expect CeeDee Lamb to continue where he left off. Obviously, that big game against the Rams, 14 targets, 12 receptions, over 150 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. This is the 3rd highest over-under of the slate for a reason. I expect both teams to be able to put up points, and I expect both of these wide receivers to be dominant in their respective matchups. But moving off of the top 6, we head on to my wide receivers 7 to 12, starting off with Jalen Waddle, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, coming in as my wide receiver 7 this week, going with that 9:30 a.m. kickoff, of course, like I mentioned with Tyreek Hill. And with Jalen Waddle, he had his best game of the season this past week against the New England Patriots. He's been the odd man out at times for this Miami Dolphins offense. Obviously, we saw at the beginning of the year, Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert's like the RB3 right now in terms of points per game. And obviously Tyreek Hill is having a legendary season, but let's not forget about Jalen Waddle. He was the wide receiver 8 in PPR last season. And like I said, he had his best game of the season this past week. And coming into this matchup, the Dolphins will need to rely upon their passing attack if they want to hold stride with these Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs' buzzsaw of a defense is limiting opposing rushing attacks to the 2nd least fantasy points allowed to running backs and ranks top 10 in rush defense DVOA. They are no joke. This Chiefs defense is for real. And if the Dolphins want to win this game, they are going to need to air it out with the weapons they have on the outside. Combining that with the fact that Raheem Mostert has been banged up throughout the week and Miami still implied for an extremely high total, I think, like I said, they rely upon this passing attack to get going and keep stride with Patrick Mahomes on the other side. We know, of course, like I said, Tyreek Hill is a stud, but Jalen Waddle has the skill set to be able to absolutely blow a game open on any single target, like I mentioned with Tyreek Hill. So I expect him to get back on track. I expect him to be that same efficient Jalen Waddle that we saw from last year, which was a back-end wide receiver 1 like I have him ranked. Adam Thielen, wide receiver of the Carolina Panthers, goes up against the Indianapolis Colts at home. And he slots in as my wide receiver 9 on the week. And it's long been overdue. He has been Charlotte Cup since week 2. 33% target share and strongholds on the team share of air yards and end zone targets. Thielen is the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd target on this team. It's time I finally showed the respect to the clear-cut wide receiver 1. Like I said, the usage has been there, so I have to give Adam Thielen his flowers. Colts represent a top 5 matchup against opposing wide receivers on the matchup chart, and Bryce Young has played much better in these recent weeks. If you have Adam Thielen, expect continued dominance. 37 targets and 30 receptions in his last 3 games played. Garrett Wilson, wide receiver of the New York Jets, comes in as my wide receiver 11. He goes to play the LA Chargers this week. And speaking of elite usage, like I said with Adam Thielen, Garrett Wilson has commanded a 33% seasonal target share, and in the last 2 weeks respectively, has garnered 38 and 39% of the Jets' targets, 25 targets in that 2-game span, and now plays a Chargers defense that ranks as the easiest matchup on the matchup chart this week. Wilson's only been able to score 2 touchdowns this year in those first 2 games, and with Garrett Wilson, he's only been able to score 2 touchdowns this year in the first 2 games he played, but he's put up 2 straight games of 17 plus PPR points despite not finding the end zone. I expect Zach Wilson to continue leaning on Garrett Wilson and for him to end up as a wide receiver 1 on the week on the back of targets. 11, 12, 13 targets in this game should be expected when it comes to Garrett Wilson and his usage. But you knew to start these guys, so now let's spend some more time on the wide receivers 13 to 30 in my rankings this week. Starting off with the high-end wide receiver 2s with wide receiver 13, Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Squeaky wheel game this past week, did have a big-time performance in that past game, despite disappointing since week 2. A.J. Brown, like we kind of mentioned above, is still the clear-cut alpha wide receiver 1 for this team. But Devontae Smith is still a very good wide receiver in his own right, and I do expect some positive regression moving forward. The game environment is very good with the high implied Eagles total, and I expect the gap between A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith to close a bit in the coming weeks as defenses start honing in on what A.J. Brown has been doing. He's had a special run. I expect Devontae Smith to catch up. Wide receiver 14 is Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts, going on the road to play the Carolina Panthers. He's the wide receiver 12 on the season, and he is averaging 15.4 PPR points per game. The Panthers have been stingy against opposing wide receivers, but the Colts are implied for 23 points in this game, and Michael Pittman Jr. has commanded 32 targets in the 3 games with Gardner Minshew as his starting quarterback. We'll get into Josh Downs in a bit. He is very deserving in his own right, but in my opinion, Michael Pittman is the clear-cut alpha wide receiver 1 for this team, and will continue to be dominant at commanding targets for this Indianapolis Colts offense. Wide receiver 15 is Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, going to play the Chicago Bears at home, and he's the most due wide receiver in fantasy football. He's turned 34 targets in these last 3 games into less than 40 PPR points. It's a favorable matchup this week against the Bears, and the Saints are 8-point favorites, implied for nearly 25 points. Olave has run, like I said, very, very unlucky this year, but the volume is elite, and Carr has looked much healthier in recent weeks after he messed up his shoulder earlier in the year against the Green Bay Packers. Like I kind of mentioned with Devontae Smith, this is the squeaky wheel game for Chris Olave. If he doesn't, we'll need to reevaluate the ceiling he has in this offense, but I do think he is due for a big-time performance, hence why he's my wide receiver 15 on the week. Wide receiver 16 is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Buffalo Bills at home this week on Sunday Night Football. This is the second highest over-under of the entire slate. Bengals, Bills, this is the type of matchup you're looking for if you have fantasy football players. I mean, quite frankly, this is going to be electric. Yes, T. Higgins has been bad all year, but last week proved to me that this offense and Joe Burrow are back to the level we expected coming into the season. Obviously, Joe Burrow was battling that calf injury for the first portion of the year. He looked healthy. He looked ready to go. I trust his talent. I trust the talent level of T. Higgins to get him back on track. T. Higgins historically has been a high-end wide receiver too, and I see no reason why he can't get back to that level this week, going up against Buffalo, and like I said, what should be a very high-scoring game, second highest over-under of the entire slate. Wide receiver 17 is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, going on the road to play the Baltimore Ravens. He got 14 targets this past week's game against the Cleveland Browns, and while it wasn't efficient to say the least against the best defense in the NFL, he proved he is the alpha wide receiver 1 of this offense. Baltimore is absolutely no joke in their own right, but the Seahawks offense has played much better football in recent weeks. This is the 3rd hardest matchup on the matchup chart, but the volume alone makes him a locked-in wide receiver 2 play, in my opinion. And then finally, wrapping up the high-end wide receiver 2s, we have Terry McLaurin coming in as my wide receiver 18 this week, going to play the New England Patriots on the road this week. The Washington Commanders are. After I called him and the Washington wide receivers out a few weeks ago, Terry McLaurin has responded with 32 targets in his last 3 games and has given high-end wide receiver 2 level of output. We saw Washington able to keep Sam Howell upright this week after conceding 4+ sacks in every other game this year, only allowed 1 this past week's game. With more protection, we're seeing Howell being able to stick in the pocket and deliver strikes to his wide receivers. A couple weeks ago, it was just straight running backs. It was just straight tight ends. We're seeing this offense expand to the wide receiver position as Sam Howell feels more protected. The Patriots are a tough matchup against wide receivers, but Sam Howell has attempted 40+ pass attempts in 4 of his last 5 games. Terry's commanded a 34% target share since week 6, and I expect that to continue coming into this week against the Patriots. But now we head on to the low-end wide receiver 2, starting off with my wide receivers 19 and 20 respectively, who played on Thursday Night Football, with George Pickens, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver of the Tennessee Titans, coming in at 19 and 20 respectively. Song and dance here. George Pickens, very, very disappointing game. 2 receptions for -1 yards on his 5 targets, 1.9 PPR points. He could have had a touchdown in this game. Clearly could have just tapped his second foot in, but for whatever reason was unable to. So if you started George Pickens, you probably weren't too fond of the fact that he was not able to score that touchdown. And it was a very disappointing night in general. DeAndre Hopkins on the flip side, 4 receptions, 60 yards on his 11 targets, 10.5 PPR points. Really, the Titans offense, I mean, Will Levis played really good ball, but it just kind of seemed disfigured at times. Very, very good first half. I believe he had all of his output in the first half, and we saw in the second half the Titans offense not be able to make adjustments. I don't really think this is going to be an issue going forward. Will Levis has looked good. DeAndre Hopkins is the clear-cut wide receiver 1. I expect him to be able to get back on track coming into next week. Wide receiver 21 is Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns, going to play the Arizona Cardinals at home this week. And this ranking has everything to do with the status of Deshaun Watson. He's been limited in practice, and I do expect him to play in this game. But if he doesn't suit up, we can drop Cooper to the wide receiver 3 status. In the 2 fully healthy games he's played with Deshaun Watson this year, Amari Cooper has earned targets and has performed extremely well. 24 and 26% target shares in those 2 games. Wide receiver 28 and wide receiver 9 respectively in those 2 weeks. His season has been up and down as a whole all year, but that has mostly to do with the volatile quarterback play we've seen with the Cleveland Browns. If Watson is healthy, I expect him to be able to continue supporting Cooper as a top 24 weekly option. The Browns are implied for nearly 24 points, meaning that Vegas expects Watson to suit up in this game. Wide receiver 22 this week is Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills, going on the road Sunday Night Football to play the Cincinnati Bengals. The most volatile wide receiver in fantasy football. Gabe Davis is the type of guy that can either win you a matchup straight up or give you a goose egg in your lineup. In this high-profile game for the Bills, like I mentioned, 49.5 over-under against one of their biggest rivals in the AFC. And with Gabe Davis, he has 3 games of over 20 PPR points this year, but also 3 games under 6 PPR points. It's a mixed bag, but he's coming off a big-time performance, commanded targets, earned 12 targets in that game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I expect him to continue momentum this week. Willing to go down swinging here. The game environment's too good. The game atmosphere is too good. I have to go with the process with Gabe Davis, the fact that he should be able to put up points in this game. Chris Godwin, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, comes in as my wide receiver 23 this week, goes up on the road to play the Houston Texans. He has a 24% seasonal target share, and he has 4 straight games of finishing as a top 25 wide receiver in fantasy. He's the model of consistency, and while his ceiling hasn't been very high on any given week, he still averages 13.23 PPR points per game on the season. Since week 4, Godwin has averaged 15.9 PPR points per game and has really closed the gap between him and Mike Evans. I just prefer Mike Evans because I like the big play upside and I like the touchdown scoring equity he has in this offense when it comes to Evans versus Godwin. Hence why Evans is a top 15 play. Chris Godwin more as a low-end wide receiver 2. Wide receiver 3s, we go on to my wide receiver 25, and that's Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, going to play the Seattle Seahawks at home this week. As a rookie, he's commanded a 28% seasonal target share, and he has earned the trust of Lamar on those critical down situations. And the thing that's keeping Flowers from being higher in this ranking solely has to do with his usage. Yes, he's getting a lot of volume, but a lot of it has been, right around the line of scrimmage. He hasn't really developed his usage down the field quite yet. He's the wide receiver 32 on the season, but only has 1 touchdown on the year. And I'm expecting some positive regression in the scoring department for him with the level that Lamar is playing at right now. And the Seahawks concede the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and the Ravens are implied for 25 points in this game. I expect this to be a get-right spot, and I expect Zay Flowers, despite disappointing these last couple weeks, to get it done in your lineup this week. Nico Collins, wide receiver of the Houston Texans, goes to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at home this week. He's been incredibly inconsistent this year, but Nico in the offense has a get-right spot against the Bucs after being limited in their last 2 games. And the ceiling is massive on any given week like we've seen, but the floor has been extremely low this year. I'm expecting very similar volatility to that of Gabe Davis. But the problem with Nico Collins is that he simply doesn't have that fallback of Josh Allen or the great game environment that Gabe Davis was. Hence why Gabe Davis ranks above him in my rankings. And with Nico Collins, I have to rank him as a wide receiver 3 given the weekly upside he presents. But if we see another down performance from Collins in this Texans offense, I will have to adjust moving forward. Wide receiver 27 on the week was Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously played on Thursday Night Football against the Tennessee Titans this week. He had his big-time performance, man. Kudos to Deontay Johnson. His first touchdown in nearly 700 days, 7 receptions, 90 yards, and that touchdown on his 9 targets. I'm going to have to reevaluate moving forward. Is it George Pickens? Is it Deontay Johnson? Is it just a mixed bag every week? Who knows? But what I do know is that Deontay Johnson clearly looks healthy and has reestablished himself as the clear-cut alpha target earner in this offense. Wide receiver 28 for me is Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts, going to play the Carolina Panthers at home this week. And Downs finally cracks my top 30, and for good reason. A 25+% target share in 3 of his last 4 games. And he's been a consistent top 30 wide receiver in that stretch. Wide receiver 28 does feel low, but I'm playing it very cautious just for one more week against the stingy Panthers defense this week. And if he continues to impress, man, he's going to be up towards the wide receiver 2 ranks in my rankings on a week-to-week basis. He's been impressive. He's young. He's efficient. I want to raise him moving forward. Wide receiver 29 for me is Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs, going to play the Miami Dolphins this week in Germany. And Rashee Rice is one of the most polarizing wide receivers in fantasy football. On the one hand, he's looked very good. He's commanded targets when he's been on the field for a Chiefs offense that needs an alpha wide receiver 1 in the worst way possible. But the problem with Rashee Rice is that he hasn't quite been a full-time player in this offense quite yet. However, his routes have gone up recently, and in a matchup with the over-under that KC and Miami has, I expect the Chiefs to lean on their best wide receiver this week. And if we can get this guy into being a full-time player for KC, I think he has legit wide receiver 2 upside moving forward. But because he plays sub 70% of the snaps right now, he's more of a fringe top 30 play. Wide receiver 30 for me this week is going to be Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the Atlanta Falcons on the road this week. Obviously, the big elephant in the room here is the fact that Kirk Cousins tore his Achilles last week, and the Vikings are expected to start Jaren Hall in this game. It's obviously a big downgrade for Addison, who's been the wide receiver 11 in fantasy this year, but I'm not exactly sure how far he should drop. He's still the de facto number 1 wide receiver until JJ gets back, and while the Falcons do pose a tough test, Addison has shown the ability to make plays after the catch. Worried about his floor with Jaron Hall starting at quarterback. Wide receiver 30 feels like a solid hedge on a guy with the talent level that Jordan Addison possesses. But moving off of my top 30 wide receivers, we head on to my 5 favorite deep flex plays. Starting off with Jonathan Mingo of the Carolina Panthers. Going to play the Indianapolis Colts at home this week. And he had his best game as a pro coming out of his bye week this past week. Carolina needs a number 2 weapon outside of Adam Thielen in this offense. And the way Bryce Young has been playing, I think he can support multiple options moving forward. This is an exploitable matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, and I expect Jonathan Mingo to continue building the momentum that we saw from him last week. Tyler Boyd, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals, going against the Buffalo Bills. Not a consistent target share as the third piece in this offense, but great game environment, and we know Buffalo is going to throw resources at stopping T. Higgins and Jamar Chase in this matchup. And to put it simply, I just want pieces of this game, especially in deeper leagues. Number 3 is going to be Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers going up against the Los Angeles Rams. He saw 78% of the snaps this week and posted over 80 receiving yards. A lot of questions surrounding Green Bay's offense right now, but I do think this is a potential get-right spot against a Rams defense that was absolutely torched against the Cowboys last week. Number 4 is going to be Brandon Cooks of the Dallas Cowboys going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. Touchdown in 2 straight games. Targets have been low in this offense so far, but he's gotten valuable looks, and in this game environment, he has a chance of beating Philadelphia over the top. Philly's back end has struggled all year, and with how bad the Cowboys have run the ball, I expect them to lean on the passing game and Dak Prescott this week. Michael Gallup saw his snaps cut down in a big way this past week, and I do think that Cooks is the clear-cut number 2 wide receiver after CeeDee Lamb in this passing offense. Number 5 is going to be Quentin Johnson of the LA Chargers going on the road to play the New York Jets. He commanded 6 targets this past week and produced 5 receptions for 50 yards on those targets, and we're finally seeing his snaps go up. He commanded a 70% snap rate this past week. Young, talented rookie first-round wide receiver. Palmer's banged up with that knee injury. Keenan Allen will get the blunt of attention from this Jets defense, and I do think that Quentin Johnson is a sneaky, top 45, top 50-ish level play for me this week. But either way, like I mentioned at the top of the video, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below, comment your biggest start-sit decisions, and of course, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 40,000. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. If you guys want access to these weekly rankings, there is one of 2 ways to access them right now. First way, if you guys go over to Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FSC, you'll get 100% match back on your first deposit up to $100, as well as full access to our weekly rankings and our rest of season rankings manifesto. The other way by doing that, if you already have an Underdog account, is by going over to flockfantasy.com using promo code FSC for 30% off either the Flocker or the Mother Flocker package. By doing so, you will get access to these rankings and more. But with that being said, peace out. Good luck in your matchups. I will see you tomorrow for running backs.